Welcome to Punctuation for Court Reporters, video number 60, punctuating for example, namely, and that is. I'm Ken Wick. Let's get started. So how do you punctuate a sentence containing one of these three transitional expressions? These three are transitional expressions. So if you had this sentence here, your offer lacks one thing, namely who pays for work. I put all these punctuation marks here, meaning what punctuation mark comes before, for example, namely, and that is usually the question that comes up in these. This is going to be your general question. And it could also be what punctuation mark comes after. Well, I'm going to tell you, it's always a comma that follows. So now, what is a punctuation that comes before? Well, based upon the style guide and what comes after, for example, namely, or that is, it could be a semicolon, colon, or comma. So this video is going to cover the four basic situations that involve these transitional expressions, and then I'm going to cover my simplified recommendation. So situation number one is the second clause, meaning the clause after the transitional expression, for example, namely, that is an independent clause. So here, I'm just going to write it out. So here's the example sentence. Your offer lacks things. For example, it's missing a schedule and who pays for work. So we know that a comma comes after. The question is what punctuation mark comes here. I'm going to indicate that it's a semicolon, because in all the reference manuals it's going to say semicolon. So the LMEG will say a semicolon comes here before, for example. And I just want to say, if you had a situation where it says namely or that is, you could substitute those here. I'm just saying you have an independent clause, the transitional expression, and we're covering, for example, namely that is, and then a second independent clause. So LMEG says it's a semicolon. The BGGP says it's a semicolon, but a period is optional if one or both sentences are long. The Greg's Reference Manual says it's a semicolon, but you could use a dash here. Is optional if you want to emphasize the second clause. And then Chicago Manual Style. I like to compare various style guides. That says a semicolon or a dash. And I want to say it tends to favor the dash in the examples in the Chicago Manual Style. And then if you're using my book, now this situation isn't really covered, but maybe it's if you base it upon rule number 21, it'd be a semicolon or a period would come here. So situation number two is the second clause. That's the clause after, for example, namely, or that is an independent clause that explains or illustrates the first sentence. Now, hopefully that sounds similar to one of my rules, which we'll get to. So here's the example sentence. Your offer lacks one thing. And then I know this may be confusing. I'll explain this, namely, who pays for the work. So once again, we know a comma always follows it. So is it a semicolon or a colon? So this really means that depending on the style guide, you're going to get a semicolon or a colon. So let's go over the various style guides. LMEG says semicolon here. The BGGP says semicolon. The Greg's Reference Manual says colon. A dash is optional for emphasis. And Chicago Manual Style says semicolon or dash. And then once again, in my rule book, the situation isn't really covered. But if you looked at Rule 24, which is the closest thing you have, it would be a colon or a semicolon, which basically matches these style guides. So situation number three, a list follows, for example. So here's our example sentence that we're working with. Once again, your offer lacks things. I know this is confusing. We'll get to it. That is your offer lacks things. That is, then we have a list. That is schedule, contract, information, and who pays. So we always know as comma follows, and then based upon the style guide, we're going to have a semicolon or colon. So LMEG says colon comes here. The BGGP says colon. The Griggs Reference Manual says colon, but a dash is optional for emphasis. And the Chicago Manual Style says semicolon or dash. So I put a semicolon because once again it tends to favor the semicolon in examples. So there you go. So it's going to be a semicolon or colon depending on the style guide that you use. That's why I format it this way. Then if you look at my book, the 99 Rules, once again, the situations isn't covered, but if you looked at Rule 24 for, this is basically about the colon, rule number 24, that you'd say, if you had to base it upon my book, and you're trying to look for something that matched it, you'd say, oh, this would be a colon, which, basically matches one of the answers. So situation number 4, an appositive follows. For example, an appositive is just something that renames that what came before it. You can think of it as something. Usually, it's like a short phrase. So, example is your offer lacks one critical thing, that is a schedule. So, since you've been looking at these examples, we always know a comma follows, and you can tell by depending on what style guide you're looking at, it's going to be a comma or a dash. I guess I should have it. This is a hyphen, but it should be a dash. Excuse me for not for incorrectly typing the punctuation mark. So looking at the various references, the LMEG actually says this would be a comma. The BGGP says it would be a dash. And the Griggs Reference Manual says it would be a comma, but you could use a dash for emphasis. And the Chicago Manual Style would be a semicolon or dash. And if you look at examples in the Chicago Manual Style, you'd probably conclude that in this situation you would use a dash if you just were looking at the examples. There's nothing in the Chicago Manual Style says use a dash with an appositive. But if you look through the examples, you'd conclude that it has, or the closest example is used as a dash. And then my book, it's not the situation, once again, is not covered, but it would probably be a colon based on Rule 24, which isn't one of these options. So, my book, doesn't cover this. So, I want to say it got, my book doesn't have this, these situations, but 3 or 4 cases it basically got you to the right answer just by looking at the various rules. Once again, my 99 rules is just covering the sort of the the primary rules of punctuation, doesn't cover them all. So this is not one of the main rules of punctuation, but using those basics, you can come up 75% of the time you can get the right answer. So what's my simplified recommendation? Well, my simplified recommendation is if it has an independent clause that follows. So this is effectively situations 1 and 2. Situation 1 was an independent clause. Situation 2 was an independent clause that explains. Use a semicolon. If you go back to those, I believe like the LMEG, both situations say use a semicolon. So if you look through those situations, if it's a list, I say what follows is a list. Use a colon. So once again, you would have an independent clause, like that is, or namely, or for example, if you had a list that follows, use a colon. And then finally, if you have an appositive or a phrase, which is, or it's really an appositive, which is basically usually a short phrase. Use a dash. So that's my simplified example. If you go back and look at the references, you'll see that they line up pretty well with the references. And then if you go with my I don't know what to call it, super simplified, but if you go with my simplified recommendation, in case this, you don't want to memorize all the various situations, then you know what? In most cases, you could just use a semicolon, because if you look at the LMEG and the Chicago Manual Style, a semicolon is used in three of the four situations. So if you use a semicolon, you're basically going to get it right 3 out of 4 times. So if you want the rule of thumb, something to stick in your head, then I would say, for example, namely, and that is, just think semicolon, but the real answer lies here. So that's it for this video. I'm going to ask you to subscribe to my videos. If you like the video, please hit like, and check out my videos and books. Thank you.